It's been so much fun getting back into the swing of things and sculpting miniatures again. And in this last part of sculpting the Goblin Baddie, I'll show you how to put the finishing touches on a miniature. The Goblin Menace Pledge Manager is open right now, and if you missed the Kickstarter, you can still get in on a late pledge. So if you enjoyed watching how the Goblin Baddie was sculpted, consider supporting the show by adding him and all his little buddies to your miniatures collection today. Alright, it's time to get sculpting! Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host Tom Mason, and on the last episode, we were sculpting the cape, getting the armature ready, getting everything in place. Well, now everything is cured, and I'm still working with putty. The Fimo is baked and hard, the putty is cured, and now I'm going to start adding on the finishing touches to complete this miniature. So in the last part, we used a lot of tricks to just kind of get the cape in place, get a general shape going, and have a sense of the movement and flow. But it's very flat, as you can see, and there's not really a lot of detail or dimension. Not to mention there's some extra little elements that need to be sculpted. In this case, like this, where the cape's going to wrap around the guy's neck. So I've added on an extra piece of green stuff. This is a mix of green stuff that I like to sculpt with. It's about 50-50 green stuff and Aves epoxy sculpt. And this will be the mix that I use throughout the remainder of this and these finishing touches. The main reason I like using this mix rather than straight green stuff is because when you go to speed up curing by throwing it in a putty oven or anything like that, it tends to significantly cut down, if not remove completely, what's called bloom. That's where as the putty is heated and cures, it starts to round off, especially at sharp edges. So it's a good material to help just keep everything a little sharper, a little crisper, and cut down on that natural rubberiness that green stuff tends to have. I don't know about you, but I have a tendency that whenever I'm sculpting with putty or something that cures on its own, I tend to do a small amount, an element, and then set it aside. It's probably more than anything kind of a bad habit that I developed. And while sometimes that is the best course of action, you can actually keep going and treat it a lot more like clay. The trick is sometimes the putty will have started to set up, and if you try and add a little more of the same mix you made, or if you even mix up a new batch and start to put it on, they can start to not work together. They don't feel the same because they're in different cure states. But they are still malleable, and so you can keep working it, and that is something that's good because you can get use a little bit of the same techniques you would with polyclay, where everything is still malleable and movable, which is really useful in this case because we are trying to make this look like one piece of solid flowing material. But the one thing you really have to keep in mind is you have to be conscious of where you have put putty and where it's not cured yet. When I'm working with Fimo or polyclay, you just know in your head everything is malleable all the time. Since putty will cure all by itself, it's very easy to get lulled into this false sense of security that, there's green stuff on there and it's hard, and so I can put my finger here to brace it, or just not be careful about keeping my hand away from the medium. But when you're sculpting with large areas of green stuff all at once and just continuing to add and not waiting to cure between sessions, you really need to just be very cognizant of that. Otherwise, you'll be constantly reworking your sculpture. All right, now that I have the major parts blocked in there, wrapping around and the neck, and added a little bit to the back there, it's time to start adding some details. So I've started to add a little bit of the fold, the gathering. I've pressed the putty down around his neck so it wouldn't be too bulky, and I'm just kind of roughing it up a little bit. And this goes back to what I was saying. You know, there's a lot of moving parts, and I want to make sure this cape looks like one piece of flowing material. So it's important that I do all of this at once, and I don't set one part, let it cure, and then try and go back to fix it later. At this point, it's been a fair amount of time, and while I'm not setting the figure aside to cure, I'm going to just keep going on it. I do mix up a fresh batch of putty, and that's because whenever I add on another detail or a finer detail, I really like to be working with a fresh batch. And in this case, while the elements will interact with each other, I might have to press down on the piece of the cloak to get a little bit more of a tighter look and effect. I'm not doing some major blending. And this will just give me a lot more control. It'll be a little easier to position these new pieces, and I don't know, I like working with soft putty. The cape is still looking a little bit flat on the top, so I've took another long kind of conical sausage shaped blob of putty, and I'm adding it in here just to create a little bit more of a rippling, flowing, flapping in the wind effect. Once I got the main shape on there and mostly blended, I go back in with my round taper color shaper just to really start to fold it down and smooth it out into the larger cape area. I don't usually use the round taper very often. My color shaper of choice is the flat chisel, but in cases like this, especially where you're pushing into concave shapes, nothing beats the round taper. And just in case anyone asks, the specific color shapers I use are a number 0 extra firm size for all of them. That's what the black tips are. And if you get everything blended in nice and smoothly like this, you can see it really starts to add a lot more dimension to the cape. It doesn't just look like a flat sheet of putty that was laid over some wire. And when I finished that, I added a little knot to kind of show how this cape is being tied around the character's neck. This is supposed to be like an old blanket that he stole and just tied around, you know, kind of like little kids do when they're playing superheroes. At this point, I did set the figure aside to cure. I don't remember if I used my putty oven or not. I probably did, because I was trying to get this guy done in a timely fashion, and that means you have to speed up the curing time. And once all the putty was cured, I went ahead and mixed up another fresh ball of putty, and I started to make a little square on my thumb here so that I could add a patch, just a little bit of an extra detail. You know, I've already got some rips and nicks in it to make it look rough and old, but I wanted to add this last little kind of cartoony element just to really sell it and kind of break up the shape, make it look a little bit more interesting than just a plain, flat, smooth texture. And this will end up being the last detail. With this done, all that remains is to find any undercuts and fill those in. Now you'll notice the whole time I was sculpting on the cape, I left the wires in place, and that's because I'm putting a lot of down pressure. Even as careful as I was going to be, I was putting a lot of down pressure on the cape, and I didn't want to do anything that might make it pop off. I forgot to record the part where I removed them, and I wanted to point this out and say that the way that I laid the cape on the wires, they were in there a little bit, but they weren't completely wrapped and closed off, and that's important. You want to leave it that way so that you can pop them out and not destroy your cape. Now, if you do happen to embed the wire into the element that you're having float out there, like in this case, the cape, you can just leave them in there. If it's too hard to get out, just snip them off. You might have to do a little bit of putty repair to cover it up, similar to how I'm adding this little bit of material right now. But in this specific case, what I'm doing is I'm filling in some of these gaps. I don't want to create a little undercut. I want to just make this element kind of flow and be as smooth as possible so it can come out of the mold very easily and not tear anything. In this case, the three main areas that I need to fill in are the spots where the wires were, the two spots where the wires were, and then underneath between his back and the cape. That's starting to fold in a little bit. It wasn't an area that I could easily get to smooth and blend in, so I'm just going to add a little bit of putty there to smooth things out and add a little bit more volume and shape to the underside. I think this is one of the most fulfilling parts of finishing a miniature, and that is when you get to pop it off of the sculpting stand. You know, you've been holding it on for so long onto this block, you don't really have a sense of the feel and the weight of the figure, but now's the chance. If you're using one of these sculpting blocks like I am, it's very easy to just take your X-Acto blade or your scalpel and just slowly and carefully work the blade between the layer of putty and your figure. Just gently, you don't want to crack or break anything, but be super, super careful, as if you're not careful with lining the blade up with the wires underneath, or you're pressing too hard, you can very easily slip, as you'll see I do, and nearly cut your finger. And there it is! From there, all you have to do is clean off any excess putty or clay that's stuck down into the stand, and go ahead and fill in any gaps you notice underneath that you couldn't reach when the figure was still on the sculpting stand. You can also go ahead and add a tab or a base. In this case, I did not. I was having some custom ones made at Forger's Figures, and Ben was super nice and helpful, and he went ahead and applied that for me when I sent them the master to make the mold. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this series, seeing a whole figure sculpted start to finish. I know I haven't done that pretty much since I started this channel on a whim many, many years ago. I hope you learned a lot, and I look forward to teaching you more. But until next time, keep sculpting.